What's up? In this video, I'm going to show you how to build cabinet doors, but not just any cabinet door. I'm going to show you how to build custom cabinet doors just like this with a herringbone pattern. Now we've got a lot to go over, so let's get started. So these doors are actually for a project that I'm currently working on, which will be in my next video. That build was already pretty detailed, so I figured I'd make a separate video showing you just how to make these doors. Now these doors are going to be inset, meaning that they won't overlap onto a face frame. So the size is really important when it comes to the fit. I like to wait until my piece is built and then get an accurate measurement right off of the piece. So I'll start out by breaking down some 8/4 white oak over at the chop saw. And I'm using white oak because that's what the cabinet that I'm currently making is made of. Then we can head over to the joiner and get one face and one edge flat and square. And then go over to the planer and get that other face parallel, getting them to 1 3/4 thick. And once everything's nice and flat, we can head over and start ripping our boards up into a bunch of thin strips. Now these strips are actually what's going to make up our pattern, and we're going to need something to attach these strips to, but we'll get to that in a minute. With the bandsaw leaving a bit of a rough finish, I headed back over to the planer to get those strips to their final thickness of 3/16 of an inch, running them through one at a time. Then I went back over to the miter saw and cleaned up both ends, ensuring that they were 90 degrees. To really make our design stand out, we're going to want to get rid of that sharp edge, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute, but I do this by installing a 1/16 inch round over into the router table and round over one side of all my strips. And here you can see what it looks like before removing that sharp edge, and then flipping it over and seeing what it looks like after adding the round over. And look how much better that looks. Yeah, much better. Now the strips were a little bit long for what I needed, so I ended up cutting them down to about 10 inches from each end, which left me with a small middle section that I actually ended up using. Now we needed some kind of backing to attach our strips to. I'm using 1/4 inch white oak veneered plywood, since these doors and cabinet are also white oak. The plywood I'm using is only veneered on one side, which is fine because it doesn't matter what the plywood looks like under all the strips, just the back side, which will be the back of the cabinet door. So when you open the door, it matches. Once we have all of our backing pieces cut to their final dimensions, we can start doing our layout for our pattern. So you're going to start out by finding the center of your panel and marking a line, then taking a speed square and marking a 45-degree angle from that center line you just found down to the edge of your piece. Then you're going to get one of your strips and mark the center of it. And then we'll line that up with the center line we drew on our panel, and then that will be our center point for the herringbone pattern. I traced out the area of this first strip so that whenever I spread my glue, I don't go too far and have a bunch of squeeze out. Then I added a little bit of CA glue, gave it a little squirt of some activator, and this will hold it in place until the wood glue dries. I only do this for the first 2 strips. After that, I'm just going to be using wood glue. The second strip is going to attach right here, like this. I clamp down my square and trace out the piece again. Spread a little wood glue, and then add a little bit of CA glue, a little activator, and stick it down again. So once you have the first 2 pieces stuck down, the rest of the process is pretty easy. You're going to spread a liberal amount of wood glue all over your panel and smear it in. And then you're going to start putting your strips down. One on the left, one on the right, one on the left, one on the right. And keep going until you get all the way down to the bottom of your panel. Then I very carefully picked up my panel and brought it over to another table. And then I realized, remember when I cut my strips in half? Well, that meant that one end didn't have that rounded profile, and I guess I flipped it around somehow. But anyway, I got it flipped back around, added a little bit more glue, and stuck it back on. Now I don't have a vacuum press or anything like that to, do veneers, so I just used a piece of scrap plywood and some cauls to clamp it to the table to apply even pressure. This was my first time trying this, so I wasn't sure if it would work. Now I only needed to do this 3 more times, and then I can move on to doing the drawer faces. So I'll repeat the same process as before, sticking down my first piece, and this time I had a little bit of squeeze out, so I scraped it off with the chisel real quick. and then kept moving on. And then I got a little smarter and I started using a glue roller instead of that little bitty brush, because that was taking a while and the glue was starting to set up. And remember when I cut down my strips, I had those little cutoffs and I told you I would put them to use? Well, they ended up being the perfect size for the corners. While the door panels dried, I moved on to working on the drawer faces, and these are going to have a bit of a different pattern. But it's fairly the same process, but we will have to cut an angle on these. So again, start off by finding the center, and then marking a 45 from the center line, on both sides this time though. And you can see where the two pieces will go, but I needed to cut a 45 for the pieces that are going to meet in the middle. So I took a couple strips over to the chop saw, set the fence to 45 degrees, and added an angle to a couple pieces. And then from there, the process is pretty much the same as the doors, adding the wood glue, a little bit of CA glue, and sticking the strip down. But I did end up doing the entire door with the CA glue instead of trying to clamp these down to a table like I did the doors. One, because I was out of plywood, and two, because I'm impatient. After letting the door sit up for a couple hours, I came back out and put a flush trim bit into the router table and started slicing off all the pieces that are overhanging. Now this probably wasn't the best idea because, as you can see, it was shooting the little cutoffs of the strips all over the shop. So I ended up taking the panels back over to the workbench and just taking a skill saw and got the majority of the waste off. Then went back over to the router table, and this was much safer. And with the panels done, we could start making our rails and stiles. So I had some 3/4 inch material already milled up from whenever I was building the cabinet. So I just took those over to the table saw and started ripping them down into 2¼ inch strips, because that's what size I'm using for my rails and stiles. Except for the drawer rails, those are only going to be 1¼ inch. Then back at the miter saw, we cut everything to length except for the door stiles. We're going to leave those a little bit long. Don't worry, I'm going to show you why. Just hold your horses. What in the world is this guy doing? Would you just get back to work already? So I used some setup blocks to set the table saw blade to 3/4 inch. And I'm using a 3/8 dado stack to cut the groove that the panels are actually going to go in. So I just find the center and make a test cut. Take it over to the panel, and it was a little tight, so I just flipped the piece around and ran it through again and rechecked it, and it fit perfect. So I went on cutting the rest of the pieces just like that, running it through one way, flipping it over, and running it through again. Once it came time to cut the tenons, I realized that my table saw sled had seen better days. So I ended up using some double-sided tape to tape down some 1/4 inch MDF to the bottom and to the back fence to help prevent it from blowing out. And using a stop block, I cut all the tenons to length. Before I could start gluing up everything, I had to clean up this one spot where I had squeeze out, and it was not easy. I tried a couple different tools, and I just slowly worked at it and ended up getting it out. If you do these, sorry, I'm 5. Anyway, if you make these doors, make sure you don't have any squeeze out because it is not fun to clean up. Now we can start putting the glue on. So I just start smearing some glue everywhere, then popping on some clamps and getting the perfect amount of squeeze out. And then after letting them set up overnight, I come back out the next day, pop off the clamps, give them a good sanding. Remember I told you I left the stiles long? Well, this is why, because I always like to cut my stiles to length after the door's been glued up so that I have a nice clean top and bottom on my doors, with no glue staining the end grain.
Well, there you have it. Cabinet doors with a herringbone pattern. Now, I'm going to get back to work on the piece that these are actually going to go into. If that's something that you want to see, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks for watching.